The flies found her first. Jedediah Hargrove noticed them swarming as he hammered the last fence post into the hard Kansas soil. He squinted against the setting sun, wiping sweat from his weathered brow with a sleeve already dark with dirt. Something was drawing the flies near the eastern boundary of Whispering Pine Ranch, something that didn't belong. Jed set down his hammer, his joints protesting after a long day's work. At 53, his body kept a careful ledger of every injury, every strain. The old bullet wound in his thigh predicted rain better than any barometer, and tonight it whispered of storms coming. He approached cautiously, one hand resting on the Remington revolver at his hip. 7 years alone on the frontier taught vigilance. What he found stopped him cold. A woman, barely conscious, leaned against his fence. Her dress, once fine but now torn to rags, was stained dark with blood, both fresh and dried. Her hair, the color of wheat ready for harvest, hung in matted clumps around a face pale as the underside of a river stone. She couldn't have been more than 26, though pain had aged her eyes. When those eyes found him, they widened not with relief, but with desperate resolve. "If you have any mercy left, kill me with one shot." Her voice rasped like dry leather, cracked from thirst and screaming. Please. Jed had seen death before, had caused it and prevented it in equal measure. But he'd never had it requested like a kindness. "You're hurt," he said, stating the obvious as his mind worked through the implications. No woman wandered the Kansas plains alone, especially not one bearing wounds like hers. "I can help you," he added, reaching toward her. She flinched violently, hand darting to her boot where Jed glimpsed the glint of a small knife. "Don't touch me. Just end it. They'll be coming." "Who's coming?" Jed knelt slowly, keeping his movements deliberate, the way he'd approach a wounded wolf. The woman's eyes fluttered, consciousness slipping. "Paxton's men," she whispered. "They always come." At the name Paxton, Jed's right hand began to tremble. An old tell he thought he'd conquered years ago. He clenched it into a fist, willing the shaking to stop. "Hiram Paxton?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hand. But the woman had slipped into unconsciousness, her breathing shallow against the growing dusk. Jed gathered her in his arms, surprised at how little she weighed. Like lifting a bird with broken wings, he carried her toward the modest, two-story cabin that stood as the centerpiece of Whispering Pine Ranch, a name more ambitious than accurate, since only a small grove of pines marked the western edge of his property. The cabin had begun as a simple one-room structure, but Jed had expanded it over the years, adding a second floor, a proper kitchen, and a covered porch. Martha had wanted a home worthy of raising children. Jed had given her that much, at least. Inside, he laid the woman on his own bed, then gathered supplies with the efficiency of long practice. Clean water from the pump, whiskey for disinfecting, bandages torn from his oldest shirts, needle and thread, just in case. The woman stirred as he began cleaning her wounds. Most were superficial, cuts and bruises from rough handling, but one gash along her shoulder needed stitching, and her wrist bore the raw marks of restraints. Jed worked quickly, his hands remembering their old skill despite the years since he'd practiced medicine properly. "Don't," she murmured, half conscious as he turned to her to examine her back. That's when he saw it, burned into her shoulder blade like a cattle brand. The letter P reversed, the mark of the Broken Spoke Ranch, Hiram Paxton's brand. "That's not my mark," Jed said quietly, "but I know whose it is." The woman's eyes flew open, suddenly alert despite her condition. "You know Paxton?" Something dark crossed Jed's face, there and gone like a cloud over the sun. "Everyone knows Paxton." "Not like I do," she whispered. "Not like you seem to." Jed didn't respond to that. Instead, he continued cleaning her wounds in silence, his touch clinical but gentle. For the first time, the woman didn't flinch away. "My name is Lillian," she offered after a while. "Lillian Thorne." "Jedediah Hargrove," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Most just call me Jed." "Are you a doctor, Mr. Hargrove?" "Once," he said, tying off a neat suture, "a long time ago." Outside, the last light faded from the sky, leaving them in the warm glow of oil lamps. Crickets began their evening chorus, a sound so constant Jed rarely noticed it anymore. But tonight, their songs seemed to emphasize the silence between words, the things neither of them were saying. When he finished, Jed offered her water and a bowl of stew he'd been saving for his own dinner. Lillian ate cautiously at first, then with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in days. "You should rest," Jed said, gathering his supplies. "We'll figure things out in the morning." "If I'm still alive in the morning," she murmured, "I'll tell you why that would be a miracle." Dawn broke over the Kansas plains with the same indifferent beauty it always did, painting the prairie grass in shades of gold and amber. Jed had spent the night in his rocking chair, rifle across his lap, watching the approach to the cabin with the vigilance of a man who expected trouble. None had come, at least not yet. The woman, Lillian, was still asleep when he checked on her. Sleep had softened the fear from her face, making her look younger, almost peaceful. The brand on her shoulder was hidden beneath the clean shirt he'd given her. But Jed couldn't forget it. He'd seen cattle marked that way, but never a human being. He prepared a simple breakfast of coffee, cornbread, and bacon, the smell eventually rousing his unexpected guest. She appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, swaying slightly, still weak but standing on her own. "You didn't kill me," she observed, voice flat. "Not my habit to shoot strangers who ask for it," Jed replied, pouring a cup of coffee. "Sit before you fall." She obeyed, lowering herself gingerly into a chair at his small table. "I wasn't in my right mind yesterday." "I figured." He set the coffee before her. "Drink, then talk." Lillian wrapped her hands around the mug, seeming to draw strength from its warmth. "How much do you know about Hiram Paxton?" Jed's right hand twitched at the name, a slight movement he quickly disguised by reaching for the coffee pot. "Cattle baron, controls most of the grazing land between here and Dodge City, has friends in high places, and enemies in early graves," Lillian added bitterly. "I worked at Broken Spoke Ranch for 2 years. I was hired as a school teacher for the children of his ranch hands." She paused, taking a sip of coffee before continuing. "Paxton can be charming when he wants something. He's not what you might expect. Not some loud, brutish cowboy. He was an officer in the Confederate Army, a brigadier general, he claims. Lost everything in the war, except his ambition." Jed's face remained impassive, but something flickered behind his eyes. "The war changed many men, some for better, some for worse. Paxton built his empire through blood and bribes," Lillian continued. "At first, I only saw the respectability he shows the world. The powerful businessman, the community leader. It wasn't until I accidentally discovered his ledger that I understood what I was really seeing." "Ledger?" Jed's interest sharpened visibly. "He keeps records of everything: cattle stolen, officials bribed, men killed, names, dates, amounts. The kind of detailed accounting you'd expect from a military man." Lillian's hands tightened around her mug. "I didn't mean to find it. I was looking for a book in his study. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it." "And he caught you," Jed surmised. "Worse. He didn't, not right away." Lillian's voice dropped to a whisper. "I copied pages, took notes. I was going to send them to my brother." She stopped abruptly, as if catching herself revealing too much. "Your brother?" Lillian hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Raymond Thorne, federal judge Raymond Thorne. He's been investigating corruption in the Kansas cattle industry for months." The name hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. A federal judge's sister, branded and nearly killed by one of the most powerful men in the territory. "When Paxton discovered who I was," Lillian continued, "he didn't kill me outright. He saw opportunity, leverage against my brother's investigation. He kept me prisoner, sending messages to Raymond that I was visiting his ranch voluntarily." Her eyes took on a faraway look. "The things he did, not just to me. I saw him order men killed for stealing a single cow. Watched him plan the burning of a homestead family who refused to sell their water rights." Jed's jaw tightened, his weathered face a mask of controlled emotion. "How did you escape?" "One of the ranch hands, a boy, really, no more than 16, took pity on me, unlocked my door during a storm when the guards were distracted." Lillian's voice caught. "Paxton probably killed him for it." She pulled up her sleeve, revealing thin white scars across her wrist. "Before that boy helped me, I tried to end it myself. I couldn't bear another day of—" She stopped, unable to continue. "That's not Paxton's work," Jed observed quietly. No, Lillian agreed. That's mine. My only act of rebellion, and I couldn't even do it properly. Jed refilled her coffee cup, his movements deliberate. You mentioned Paxton's men would be coming. They've been tracking me for 3 days. I stole something when I escaped. From inside her tattered bodice, Lillian withdrew a small, leather-bound book. Pages from his ledger, enough to hang him 20 times over. Jed didn't reach for the book. Instead, he stood and walked to the window, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. Paxton and I have an old debt unsettled. You know him personally? Lillian asked. Jed's silence was answer enough. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, grown distant. The war made monsters of many men, Miss Thorne. Some wore blue, some wore gray. Some, like me, wore both. You fought for both sides? I was a surgeon, Jed corrected. I treated whoever was bleeding in front of me. Union, Confederate. It didn't matter once they were on my table. That's honorable, Lillian offered. A bitter smile touched Jed's lips. Honor had little place in that war, especially near the end. He turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. After the war, I came west with my wife Martha. Wanted to leave death behind. Build something instead of just patching up destruction. You had a family? Lillian glanced around the cabin, noticing for the first time small touches that suggested a woman's hand. Curtains faded but still hanging. A quilt folded neatly over a chair. Had, Jed confirmed, the single word carrying the weight of mountains. Martha and our son, Samuel. 7 years ago, while I was in Dodge City trading, our farm was burned. Martha died in the fire. And your son? They said he died too. Jed's voice was flat, emotionless. Nothing left to bury. I'm sorry, Lillian whispered. It was ruled an accident. Jed returned to the table, his movements stiff. But there were tracks, men on horseback, and a fence post with a brand burned into it. Paxton's brand, Lillian guessed, her face paling. Jed nodded once. No proof it was him, no witnesses. The law wasn't interested in pursuing it. Because Paxton owns the law, Lillian said bitterly. Not all of it, but enough. Jed stared into his coffee as if reading the future in its dark surface. I tracked the men who did it, found 3, left them breathing, but they won't ever ride again. Never found the 4th. Lillian studied him, seeing beyond the weathered rancher to something harder beneath. You weren't just a doctor in the war, were you? Jed didn't answer directly. I've spent 7 years trying to forget the man I was, building this place, keeping to myself. His right hand trembled slightly before he clenched it into a fist. Then you show up wearing Paxton's brand, and it feels like the past reaching out to claim its due. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant call of meadowlarks from the prairie. The morning sun streamed through the windows, dust motes dancing in its beams, creating an atmosphere of deceptive peace. What will you do with me? Lillian finally asked. If you turn me over to Paxton, I won't. Jed's response was immediate and firm. Whatever debt Paxton and I share, it doesn't include trading in human lives. Then I should leave. My presence puts you in danger. You wouldn't make 5 miles in your condition. Jed stood, decision made. Rest today, regain your strength. Tomorrow we'll decide what's next. That evening, as darkness settled over the prairie, Jed sat on his porch cleaning his rifle, the familiar ritual calming his troubled thoughts. Lillian joined him, wrapped in a blanket against the evening chill, her presence silent but no longer fearful. Moonlight silvered the landscape, transforming the ordinary plains into something otherworldly. From somewhere in the distance came the mournful howl of a coyote, lonely and plaintive. Without warning, Lillian began to hum softly, the melody unfamiliar but haunting. When she noticed Jed listening, she stopped abruptly. Don't, he said. It's been a long time since there was music here. After a hesitant moment, she continued, the tune gaining words in a soft, clear voice. Sleep, my child, and peace attend thee, all through the night. Guardian angels God will send thee, all through the night. The lullaby hung in the night air like a ghost from a gentler past. Jed's hands stilled on his rifle, his expression hidden in shadow. My mother sang that to me, Lillian explained softly. It was the only thing that gave me comfort during those nights at Paxton's ranch. Jed nodded once, unable to speak. Martha had sung that same lullaby to Samuel every night, her voice carrying through their small cabin like a blessing. Some coincidences felt too pointed to be accident, too painful to be chance. Get some rest, he finally managed. Tomorrow comes early. But long after Lillian had gone inside, Jed remained on the porch, rifle across his knees, watching the dark horizon as if expecting it to burst into flame at any moment. The nightmare came as it always did, fragments of memory distorted by time and guilt. The field hospital at Antietam, blood soaking into the ground until the earth couldn't drink anymore. Men screaming for mothers, for for death, his hands moving mechanically from patient to patient, deciding with a glance, this one might live, this one won't. The weight of a bone saw in his hand. Then the Confederate officer on his table, chest torn open by grape shot. A fighting chance if Jed worked quickly. But beside him, a young Union private, gut shot and fading. Only time for one, the officer's eyes finding his. Save him first, he'd said, nodding to the private. He's just a boy. But Jed had already made his choice. Jed woke with a start, hand automatically reaching for the revolver beside his chair. Dawn was still hours away, the cabin quiet except for the ticking of the old clock Martha had insisted on bringing west. He rubbed his face, feeling the rough scrape of stubble, then rose silently to check on his guest. Lillian slept fitfully, her brow furrowed even in rest. The bruises on her face had darkened overnight, mapping the abuse she'd suffered. Jed adjusted the blanket over her shoulder, then withdrew to let her sleep. In the main room, he built up the fire and put coffee on to boil, movements practiced from years of solitary mornings. As the cabin slowly warmed, he opened a loose floorboard beneath the rag rug, revealing a small compartment. From it, he withdrew an oilskin-wrapped bundle. Unwrapped on the table, the contents spoke of a different man than the quiet rancher. A Union Army field surgeon's kit, well-maintained despite years of disuse. A folded blue uniform with captain's insignia. A leather-bound journal filled with tight, precise handwriting. And a smaller wooden box containing a single silver medal, the Medal of Honor, awarded for valor behind Confederate lines. Jed stared at these remnants of his past, items he hadn't looked at in years. The medal gleamed in the firelight, mocking him with its shine. He had never felt he deserved it. You were a hero, Lillian's voice came softly from the bedroom doorway. Jed looked up, surprised to find her watching. He'd been too distracted by ghosts to hear her approach, a dangerous lapse of awareness. No, he corrected, rewrapping the items. Just a man who did what was needed. The Medal of Honor isn't given for nothing. Sometimes it's given for the wrong things. Jed returned the bundle to its hiding place. Coffee's ready, if you want some. Lillian accepted the change of subject, moving carefully to the table. Her strength was returning, but slowly. She watched as Jed prepared a simple breakfast of biscuits and bacon. You need to know what you're harboring, she said abruptly, before you decide what to do next. I'm listening. Jed set a plate before her. I told you my brother is investigating corruption in the cattle industry. What I didn't explain is the scale of what Paxton is involved in. She leaned forward, voice dropping as if afraid of being overheard even here. It's not just stealing cattle or bribing local officials. He's building an empire across 3 territories, manipulating beef prices, smuggling arms to hostile Indian tribes to drive out smaller ranchers, even controlling who gets appointed as federal marshals. Jed's expression remained neutral, but his attention was focused completely on her words. The ledger proves all of it, Lillian continued. Names, dates, amounts paid. But Paxton discovered I'd seen it. He was going to use me as leverage against Raymond, force him to drop the investigation. Your brother, the judge, knows you're missing? Jed asked. He's been searching for me for months. Paxton sent him letters in my handwriting, forced me to write them, saying I was traveling, visiting friends. Raymond wouldn't have believed it, but he had no way to find me. Lillian's hand trembled as she reached for her coffee. The night I escaped, I overheard Paxton talking with his foreman. Raymond is scheduled to arrive in Dodge City next week. They're planning something. An ambush, I think. Jed absorbed this, his mind calculating distances and time. Dodge City is 2 days' hard ride from here. I have to warn him, Lillian insisted. The pages I took, she gestured to the small book. They're not just about cattle rustling. They're evidence of a conspiracy that goes all the way to the territorial governor. That makes them even more dangerous to possess, Jed observed. I know. Lillian met his gaze directly. That's why I asked you to kill me yesterday. If Paxton recovers these pages, if he silences me and my brother, there's no one left who can stop him. Jed was silent for a long moment, weighing options, measuring risks. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. You need more than shelter, Miss Thorne. You need allies. I don't have any left. Anyone who helped me would be signing their death warrant, Bob. Perhaps. Jed's eyes took on a hardness that transformed his face, showing glimpses of the man he'd once been. But Paxton's not the only one who knows how to fight a war. He stood, decision made. We'll leave for Dodge City tomorrow. Your brother needs warning, and those pages need to reach the proper authorities. You'd risk everything, your ranch, your life, for a stranger? Lillian asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Not for a stranger, Jed corrected. For justice that's 7 years overdue. Lillian studied him, seeing the resolve in his weathered features. Paxton's not just dangerous because of his men or his money. There's something wrong in him, something broken that enjoys breaking others. I've met men like that before, Jed said, on both sides of the war. Were you one of them? The question was direct, almost challenging. Jed paused, the question striking deeper than she could know. There were times, he admitted finally, when I found it too easy to decide who lived and who died. When I forgot I was meant to heal, not harm. He turned to look out the window, his profile sharp against the morning light. Martha saved me from that darkness. Reminded me what it meant to be human again. And when you lost her? I nearly lost myself too. His right hand trembled slightly before he clenched it into a fist. But Samuel needed a father, not a ghost. Your son, Lillian said softly. You speak of him in present tense. Jed's expression closed like a door shutting. Old habit. But something in his voice suggested more than habit. A stubborn refusal to accept what logic told him must be true. A father's desperate hope that defied all reason. We should prepare, he said, changing the subject abruptly. You'll need proper clothes for riding, and you should learn to defend yourself. I'm not helpless, Lillian protested. I grew up in a family of hunters before I became a teacher. I can track and shoot. Jed raised an eyebrow, reassessing her. Good, you'll need those skills. They spent the rest of the morning taking inventory of supplies. Jed brought out a map, marking their route to Dodge City, not the direct trail, but a less traveled path that would make them harder to track. He showed Lillian his small arsenal, 2 revolvers, a Winchester repeating rifle, and a shotgun for close encounters. Choose one, he instructed, laying the handguns before her. Whichever feels right in your grip. Lillian selected the smaller Colt, her hand wrapping around it with surprising familiarity. My father believed every woman should know how to protect herself. Wise man, Jed demonstrated how to clean and load it, though she clearly already knew. The teaching was more ritual than necessity, a way of establishing trust between them. By afternoon, dark clouds had gathered on the western horizon, promising the storm Jed's leg had predicted. They moved their preparations inside, sorting supplies, packing saddlebags with essentials. As Jed reached for ammunition stored on a high shelf, his shirt pulled up slightly, revealing a massive scar tissue along his side. The unmistakable pattern of a shotgun blast that should have been fatal. Lillian noticed but said nothing, adding it to the growing puzzle of the man who'd saved her life. A doctor who carried guns with practiced ease. A rancher with a Medal of Honor hidden beneath his floorboards. A grieving husband and father whose hands still shook with rage at the mention of Hiram Paxton. You should rest, Jed advised as evening approached. We leave at first light. But rest proved elusive for both of them. The approaching storm brought with it a heavy, expectant tension that filled the cabin. Lillian found herself drawn again to the porch where Jed sat watching the lightning dance across distant clouds. I've been thinking, she said, settling beside him, about your connection to Paxton. It's more than just what happened to your family, isn't it? Jed was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was low, almost lost beneath the rumble of approaching thunder. Antietam, he said, September 1862, bloodiest day of the war. I was a field surgeon with the Union Army. We were overwhelmed with wounded, both sides all mixed together. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face in stark relief. Confederate officer came in, chest torn open by grape shot. I recognized him immediately. Hiram Paxton. He'd been a doctor before the war, believe it or not. We'd attended the same medical lecture in Baltimore once. Paxton was a doctor? Lillian couldn't hide her shock. Hard to imagine, isn't it? A bitter smile touched Jed's lips. On my table, he recognized me too, and next to him was a young Union private, gut-shot, bleeding out. The implication hung between them, heavy as the storm clouds. You chose to save the Union soldier, Lillian guessed. I chose, Jed confirmed, the words carrying the weight of decades. Paxton survived anyway. Field hospitals were chaotic. Another surgeon found him, patched him up enough to be taken prisoner. He spent 6 months in a Union prison camp before being exchanged. And he blamed you. With reason. Jed's honesty was unflinching. I violated my oath that day, chose a side instead of seeing only patients. It was war, Lillian offered. Impossible choices. War explains, Jed said, but doesn't excuse. Paxton lost more than his health in that prison camp. He lost his family estate in Virginia, his medical practice, his standing. When he came west after the war, he was rebuilding from nothing. So he built an empire of blood and corruption instead, Lillian concluded. And I built this, Jed gestured to his modest ranch, both of us trying to forget what we were, what we'd done. Thunder rolled closer, vibrating through the porch boards beneath them. The first heavy raindrops began to fall, raising dust where they struck the dry earth. Do you think he recognized you? Lillian asked. When your family... I don't know, Jed admitted. Never saw him, only his handiwork. But I've often wondered. Lillian was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of what he'd shared. My mother used to say that secrets are stones we carry. The longer we hold them, the heavier they become. Your mother sounds wise. She was. Lillian smiled sadly. She died when I was 16. Consumption. I helped raise my younger brothers while Raymond studied law. You mentioned growing up in a family of hunters, Jed prompted, grateful for the shift away from his own past. My father was a fur trapper in the Minnesota Territory, Lillian explained. He taught all of us, even the girls, to track, hunt, and survive. Said the wilderness didn't care if you wore trousers or skirts when a blizzard hit. How did you become a teacher? Raymond's doing. After father died, he insisted I get proper schooling. Said I had a mind too sharp to waste in the woods. Her expression softened at the memory. I discovered I loved books as much as forests. Became a teacher to share that love with children who might otherwise never know it. The rain fell harder now, drumming on the cabin roof in a soothing rhythm. Despite the danger waiting for them tomorrow, despite the ghosts of the past surrounding them, there was an unexpected comfort in this shared moment of truth. The lullaby you sang last night, Jed said suddenly. Martha used to sing it to Samuel every evening. Lillian turned to him, surprised by the personal admission. It's an old Welsh song. My grandmother taught it to my mother. Martha learned it from her grandmother, too. Jed's voice was soft with memory. Samuel couldn't sleep without it. Even when he was 7 and claimed he was too old for lullabies, he'd still ask for the song every night. For the first time since she'd arrived, Lillian saw genuine warmth in Jed's eyes, quickly hidden but unmistakable. Not all of him had died with his family. The moment was shattered by the sharp crack of a branch breaking somewhere in the darkness beyond the porch. Jed was on his feet instantly, rifle raised, scanning the rain-soaked yard. Inside, he ordered quietly, douse the lamps. Lillian obeyed without question, moving swiftly despite her injuries. Within seconds, the cabin was dark, their earlier feeling of safety replaced by taut vigilance. Jed positioned himself by a window, rifle ready, his body transformed by tension into something harder, more dangerous. The rancher was gone, replaced by the soldier he'd once been. They waited in silence, listening to the rain and thunder, senses straining for any sound that didn't belong to the storm. Minutes stretched into an hour, tension building with each lightning flash that illuminated the empty yard. Just as Jed began to think he'd overreacted, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A shadow detaching itself from the darkness near the barn, moving with deliberate care toward the cabin. Back bedroom, he whispered to Lillian. Under the bed is a trap door. If shooting starts, take it. Tunnel leads to the creek. I won't leave you, she protested. Not asking. His voice left no room for argument. Those pages need to reach your brother. That's the mission. Everything else is secondary. Before she could respond, another shadow appeared, then a third. Paxton's men had found them, and the storm that should have covered their departure tomorrow would now cover a fight for survival instead. Lightning split the sky, and in its brief, brilliant illumination, Jed counted at least 5 men approaching from different directions. They'd come prepared for resistance, expecting to find more than a solitary rancher and an injured woman. Lillian, he said quietly, run. The first shot shattered the window beside him, sending glass spraying across the floor as the long night of reckoning began. The first bullet splintered the window frame inches from Jed's head. He dropped low, returning fire with calculated precision, not aiming to kill, but to force his attackers to retreat for cover. The thunderstorm provided a chaotic backdrop of light and sound, momentarily disorienting anyone caught in the open. Hargrove, a voice called through the downpour. We just want the woman. Hand her over and you walk away clean. Jed's response was another well-placed shot that sent the speaker diving behind a water trough. He used the moment to glance back at Lillian, who stood frozen in the shadows of the hallway. The tunnel, he reminded her urgently. Instead, she moved to the gun cabinet, retrieving the Colt revolver they'd practiced with earlier. 5 of them, 2 of us, she said with grim determination. Better odds than I've had all week. A volley of shots peppered the front of the cabin, forcing them both to the floor. Wood splinters showered around them as bullets found purchase in the walls. Stubborn woman, Jed muttered, but there was a grudging respect in his tone. You can lecture me if we survive, Lillian replied, crawling to position herself at the second window. They fell into a rhythm born of desperation, one providing cover fire while the other reloaded, keeping the attackers at bay through disciplined shooting rather than wasted ammunition. Jed noted with approval that Lillian's earlier claim about her shooting skills hadn't been exaggerated. She fired with the calm precision of someone raised with a gun in hand. A lull in the shooting outside suggested their attackers were reconsidering their approach. Jed used the moment to reload and assess their situation. The storm had intensified, rain now coming down in blinding sheets that limited visibility to mere yards. A tactical advantage if used properly. They'll try to flank us through the barn next, he predicted, gesturing toward the structure connected to the main house by a covered walkway. When I give the signal, lay down fire toward the front. I'm going to circle behind them. That's suicide, Lillian protested. It's strategy, Jed countered. I know this land. They don't. Before she could argue further, he was moving toward the back door, pausing only to grab his medical bag. A curious choice for a man heading into combat. At her questioning look, he offered a grim smile. Old habits. Slipping into the storm was like entering another world. Rain immediately soaked through Jed's clothing, plastering his shirt to the old scars that mapped his body. He moved with a silence that belied his size, decades-old training returning with fluid certainty. The darkness between lightning flashes became his ally, the thunder masking his footsteps as he circled wide around the property. Inside the cabin, Lillian steadied her breathing the way her father had taught her when hunting deer. Slow inhales through the nose, gentle exhales through barely parted lips. She'd never shot at men before, but these weren't men to her anymore. They were extensions of Paxton, of the horror she'd endured. A movement near the barn caught her attention. She fired twice, driving the figure back into shelter. The return fire confirmed she'd spotted one of the attackers trying exactly what Jed had predicted. Lightning illuminated the yard in stark relief, and for an instant, she glimpsed Jed moving like a shadow behind the attacker's position. Then darkness swallowed him again, leaving her to wonder if she'd imagined it. The first attacker fell to a precision strike from behind, not a bullet, but the calculated application of pressure to the carotid artery that rendered him unconscious in seconds. Jed lowered the man silently to the mud, relieving him of his weapons before moving to his next target. The second man sensed something wrong a moment too late. He turned just as Jed closed the distance between them, managing a startled, "What the?" before a precisely delivered blow incapacitated him. This one Jed bound with the man's own belt, improvising a gag from a bandana in his medical bag. 3 remained, their attention focused on the cabin where Lillian continued her disciplined defense. Jed circled to approach from the side of the barn, using the structure for cover. His right hand began to tremble, the old war injury acting up at the worst possible moment. He clenched his fist, willing the weakness away, forcing his body to obey through sheer determination. Inside, Lillian was running low on ammunition. She'd counted her shots carefully, but with only one revolver and limited spare bullets, mathematics was becoming her enemy. When the front door suddenly splintered under the impact of a shotgun blast, she knew time was running out. "Hargrove abandoned you, girl," one of the attackers called. "Smart man, now it's just you against us." Lillian didn't waste breath responding. Instead, she retreated to the hallway, seeking better cover as the door gave way under a second blast. The first attacker charged through, shotgun leading the way, only to stumble backward as Jed appeared behind him, yanking him off balance with an arm around his throat. "Not quite alone," Jed growled, disarming the man with practiced efficiency. The remaining attackers retreated in disarray, one firing wildly as they ran for their horses. Jed let them go, focusing instead on securing the prisoner he'd taken. "Reinforcements?" Lillian asked as she emerged from the hallway, Colt still trained on the captured man. "Doubt it," Jed replied, binding the man's hands. "These were scouts, not the main force. Paxton's too careful to commit all his resources without knowing what he's facing." The prisoner, a hard-faced man in his 30s with a poorly healed broken nose, glared up at them. "You're dead, both of you," he spat. "Paxton will burn this place to the ground when he hears about this." "He tried that once," Jed said with dangerous calm. "Didn't take." He dragged the man to a chair, securing him firmly before checking his pockets. The search yielded a folded paper with a crude map of the region, several routes marked in pencil. "How did you find us?" Jed demanded. The man sneered, remaining silent until Jed pressed his thumb into a pressure point that sent white-hot pain lancing through the prisoner's shoulder. "Farmhand in Oak Ridge," he gasped. "Said he saw a woman matching her description heading this way." "Oak Ridge is 20 miles east," Jed noted, glancing at Lillian. "You came a long way." "Didn't have much choice," she replied. "Wasn't exactly welcome anywhere. Once word spread Paxton was looking for me." Jed turned his attention back to the prisoner. "How many men does Paxton have searching?" When the man hesitated, Jed applied pressure again, his expression impassive as the prisoner writhed. "3 groups," the man finally answered. 5 men each, covering different directions. "And your orders if you found her?" "Bring her back alive," the prisoner admitted. "Kill anyone helping her." Jed exchanged a glance with Lillian, both recognizing the implications. Paxton wanted her for something specific, likely to neutralize her brother's investigation, as she'd suspected. "One more question," Jed said, leaning closer to the prisoner. "Does Paxton know who I am?" Confusion crossed the man's face. "You're just some rancher." A flicker of something, relief, disappointment, crossed Jed's features. "Good enough," he murmured, straightening. "Lillian, gather whatever you can carry. We leave in 5 minutes." "What about them?" she asked, gesturing toward the prisoner and the unconscious men outside. "They'll be found eventually." Jed's tone suggested it wasn't his primary concern, but we'll be long gone by then. Working with urgent efficiency, they gathered essential supplies, ammunition, food, medical equipment, warm clothing. Jed retrieved the oilskin bundle from beneath the floorboards, hesitating only briefly before adding it to his saddlebag. Outside, the storm was beginning to abate, which meant they'd soon lose the cover of heavy rain. Jed led 2 horses from the barn, a sturdy chestnut gelding for himself and a smaller, nimbler bay mare for Lillian. "Her name's Penny," he said as he helped Lillian mount despite her protests that she could manage. "She's sure-footed and smarter than most people I know. Trust her if you get separated from me." "That won't happen," Lillian said firmly. Jed didn't contradict her, but his expression suggested he was planning for all contingencies. As they prepared to depart, Jed paused for one last look at the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the home that should have sheltered his family through decades of seasons. For 7 years, it had been his anchor, the physical manifestation of his determination to keep living despite everything he'd lost. Now he was leaving it behind, perhaps forever. "We can find another way." Lillian offered softly, reading his hesitation. Jed shook his head. Some debts can only be settled in person. He turned his horse toward the western trail. Let's ride. They traveled through the remainder of the night, pushing the horses as hard as they dared on rain-slicked trails. Jed set a punishing pace, guided by an internal map born of years exploring the territory. He led them away from established trails, following creek beds and game paths that wouldn't appear on any standard map. By dawn, they had covered nearly 20 miles, the rain finally giving way to a pearl-gray sky streaked with pink. Jed called a halt in a small copse of cottonwoods beside a stream, the horses badly in need of rest. As Lillian slid from the saddle, her legs buckled beneath her. Jed caught her before she could fall, his touch impersonal but gentle. "You're pushing yourself too hard," he observed, noting the fresh blood seeping through her bandages. "Your wounds need tending." "We don't have time," she protested. "Wait time," Jed countered, already retrieving supplies from his saddlebag. "A dead messenger delivers no messages." She submitted to his ministrations with reluctance, watching as he cleaned and redressed her injuries with practiced hands. In the growing light, she studied him more carefully than she had before, noting the network of scars visible where his collar gaped open, the precise economy of his movements, the eyes that missed nothing. "You're staring," he noted without looking up. "Trying to reconcile the doctor with the fighter," she admitted, "the man who refuses to kill with the one who moves like a predator." Jed's hands paused momentarily. "War makes contradictions of us all. It's been over for 20 years. "Not in here," Jed tapped his temple briefly before resuming his work. "Some battlefields you carry with you." When he finished, he set about preparing a cold breakfast from their supplies. They ate in companionable silence, the woods around them gradually awakening with the birdsong and rustling leaves. "We should reach Dodge City by tomorrow evening if we maintain our pace," Jed said, studying their map. "Your brother arrives when?" 3 days from now, according to what I overheard at Paxton's ranch." Lillian hesitated. "If we're too early, Paxton's men in town might spot us before Raymond arrives." "Better early than late." Jed traced a route with his finger. "We'll approach from the north. Less traveled, less chance of being seen. I know a place outside town where we can wait safely." "You seem to know this area well." "Had to learn it," Jed replied. "After Martha and Samuel." He paused, correcting himself. "After I lost them, I spent months tracking the men responsible. Covered every mile within a 100-mile radius." Lillian watched him carefully. "You said had to learn it. You're not from here originally?" "Pennsylvania, small town near Pittsburgh." A faint smile touched his lips. "Martha used to say I was made for city walls and hospital corridors, not open skies and cattle." "She was wrong," Lillian observed. "You belong to this land now." Jed didn't respond, but something in his posture eased slightly. After a moment, he rose and began checking the horses, signaling an end to their rest. "1 hour," he announced, "then we ride again." True to his word, they were back in the saddle within the hour, continuing their westward journey through increasingly rugged terrain. Jed set a grueling pace, pushing both horses and riders to their limits. By midday, they reached a rocky outcropping that provided a natural lookout point. Jed dismounted, retrieving a brass spyglass from his saddlebag to survey the trail behind them. "Riders," he announced grimly. 6, maybe 7. Moving fast." Lillian joined him, squinting against the sun. "Paxton's men?" "Can't tell from this distance, but it's a safe assumption." Jed collapsed the spyglass with a sharp click. "They're following our trail. Good trackers." "What do we do?" Jed considered their options, calculating distances and terrain. "There's an old mining settlement about 10 miles ahead. Abandoned now, but the buildings are still standing. We might find shelter there. Maybe set an ambush of our own." "Or be trapped," Lillian pointed out. "Every choice has its risks." Wait, Jed remounted his horse. "But if those men catch us in open country, our chances diminish considerably." They pushed on at an even faster pace, the horses lathered with sweat despite the cool air. Jed led them through a series of ravines and dry creek beds, occasionally doubling back or taking seemingly illogical turns. Tactics to confuse their pursuers, Lillian realized. The abandoned mining settlement appeared on the horizon like a mirage, a cluster of weathered buildings half reclaimed by nature. As they drew closer, Lillian saw that what had once been a bustling community was now a ghost town, empty doorways yawning like open mouths, broken windows staring blindly at the sky. Silver Strike, Jed explained as they approached. Boomed for 3 years, then the vein ran dry. Been abandoned since '79. They rode directly to what had once been the town's livery stable, a structure still sound enough to shelter the horses. Inside, Jed quickly assessed their situation, formulating a plan with military precision. They'll be here within the hour, he predicted, checking his weapons. We need to use that time to prepare. What followed was a crash course in tactical defense. Jed moved through the ghost town with purpose, identifying choke points, establishing fallback positions, creating improvised traps from the detritus of the abandoned settlement. Lillian matched his pace, following instructions without question, her own survival instincts sharpened by months of captivity and flight. You've done this before, she observed as they rigged a tripwire across one of the likely approach routes. Once or twice, Jed acknowledged. During the war, I wasn't always behind the lines. The Medal of Honor, she recalled. It wasn't for medical service, was it? Jed paused, his expression unreadable. No. Before he could elaborate, a distant dust cloud on the horizon signaled their pursuer's approach. Jed immediately shifted focus, directing Lillian to her position in what had once been the town's general store. Remember, he instructed, we're not trying to kill them. Just discourage pursuit. Aim for legs or arms if you must shoot. Understand? Lillian nodded, though her expression suggested she might have fewer moral qualms about lethal force than he did. And if things go wrong, Jed added, the horses are ready, ride north, then west. Follow the North Star after dark. You'll reach Dodge City eventually. I'm not leaving you, Bauman, Lillian said firmly. Jed's expression softened momentarily. Stubbornness must run in the Thorne family. Then he was gone, moving to his own position in the abandoned sheriff's office across the street. Lillian settled into wait, Colt revolver ready, heart pounding against her ribs with a rhythm that felt like borrowed time. The approaching riders entered the town cautiously, clearly suspecting a trap. They moved in formation, weapons ready, scanning the empty buildings with professional vigilance. Lillian counted 8 men, more than they'd anticipated, and better armed than the previous attackers. The first trap triggered with a satisfying crash, a carefully balanced pile of debris that sent the lead riders scrambling for cover. In the ensuing confusion, Jed fired 2 precise shots that disabled but didn't kill. The response was immediate and overwhelming, a hail of bullets that splintered wood and shattered glass throughout the abandoned street. Lillian waited for her moment, then took careful aim at a man trying to flank Jed's position. Her shot caught him in the thigh, sending him sprawling with a howl of pain. She ducked back as return fire peppered the storefront, forcing her to crawl to a new vantage point. The gunfight escalated quickly, both sides expending ammunition in a deadly exchange that echoed through the ghost town. Jed's traps slowed the attackers' advance, but their superior numbers were gradually becoming the deciding factor. A bullet splintered the window frame beside Lillian, sending wooden shards slicing across her cheek. She fired back instinctively, her shot going wide as she scrambled for better cover. Across the street, Jed was pinned down by concentrated fire. She could see him calculating odds, measuring distances, looking for an escape route that wouldn't leave her vulnerable. Their eyes met briefly across the bullet-swept street, a wordless communication passing between them. In that moment of distraction, neither noticed the attacker who had circled around through the adjacent building. Lillian sensed rather than saw the movement behind her, turning a second too late as a towering figure lunged from the shadows. The impact drove her to the floor, the Colt spinning from her grasp. Her attacker, a bearded mountain of a man, grinned with savage triumph as his hands closed around her throat. Paxton wants you alive, he growled, but he didn't specify undamaged. Lillian fought with desperate strength, clawing at his face, driving her knee upward with all the force she could muster. The man grunted but maintained his grip, slowly cutting off her air. Darkness crept into the edges of her vision, the world narrowing to the hateful face above her. As consciousness began to slip away, her hand closed around a shard of broken glass on the floor beside her. With the last of her strength, she drove it deep into her attacker's side. The man's howl of pain and surprise was cut short by the butt of a revolver crashing against his temple. He collapsed beside her, revealing Jed standing in the doorway, expression cold with controlled fury. "Can you move?" he asked, extending his hand. Lillian nodded, accepting his help to rise on shaky legs. The others? Regrouping for another push. Jed led her quickly toward the back door. Time to disappear. They slipped out through a rear window, crouching low as they made their way through the skeletal remains of the mining settlement. Behind them, gunfire continued as their pursuers shot at shadows, unaware that their quarry had already escaped. Jed led them to a decrepit mine entrance, half hidden by overgrown scrub. "Old escape tunnel," he explained, ducking into the dark opening. "Connects to the livery stable, used during Indian raids back in the day." They navigated the narrow passage by touch, emerging minutes later where their horses waited. Without wasting words, they mounted and slipped away through a back trail, leaving the ghost town and their pursuers behind. They rode hard for hours, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Paxton's men. Jed pushed their pace beyond what seemed reasonable, switching directions frequently, using every trick of the frontier to obscure their trail. It was nearly dusk when Jed finally called a halt, the horses too exhausted to continue safely. They made cold camp in a sheltered ravine, not daring to risk a fire that might betray their position. Lillian's hands trembled as she ate jerky and hardtack, the aftermath of fear and adrenaline working through her system. The bruises on her throat were darkening rapidly, painful evidence of her near-death experience. Jed watched her with unreadable eyes as he checked and cleaned his weapons, an automatic routine that spoke of years of disciplined survival. "Thank you," Lillian said finally, breaking the silence, "for saving my life." Again. Jed nodded once, acknowledgement rather than acceptance of gratitude. "It was closer than I'd like." "Closer than I'd like too," she attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm starting to think I'm more trouble than I'm worth." "Worth is subjective," Jed replied, surprising her with the philosophical turn. "To your brother, you're beyond price. To justice, those pages you carry might be worth 1,000 lives. To Paxton," he paused. "To Paxton, you're the embodiment of his vulnerability, his fear." "I find that hard to believe," Lillian touched her bruised throat. "Paxton doesn't strike me as a man who fears anything." "All men fear something," Jed said with a quiet certainty, "usually what they've worked hardest to deny." They lapsed into silence again, the only sounds the soft nickering of the horses and the distant call of a hunting owl. Above them, stars began to appear in the deepening blue of twilight, cold and remote as forgotten promises. "Why are you really helping me?" Lillian asked suddenly. "It can't just be because of Paxton. You could have settled that score years ago if that's all you wanted." Jed considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "At first," he admitted, "it was opportunity, a chance to finally confront the man who took everything from me. And now?" "Now," he looked at her directly, his weathered face softened by the gathering darkness. "Now it's about making a choice I can live with. Being the man Martha believed I could be, not the one the war made me." "The one who heals rather than harms," Lillian suggested. "Something like that." Jed returned to his weapons, the conversation clearly finished in his mind. Lillian watched him work, seeing beyond the taciturn exterior to the complexity beneath. A man carrying ghosts yet still moving forward. A healer who knew precisely how to hurt. A solitary figure who'd risk everything for a stranger because it was the right thing to do. "Get some rest," Jed advised, not looking up from his task. "Dawn comes early, and Dodge City is still a hard day's ride away." Lillian settled into her bedroll, exhaustion quickly overwhelming her, despite the hard ground and lingering fear. Her last conscious thought was that for the first time in months, she felt something dangerously close to hope. Dawn arrived with crimson streaks across a pearl gray sky, promising fair weather that would make tracking them easier for their pursuers. Jed was already awake, if he'd slept at all, preparing a cold breakfast of jerky and dried fruit. "How's the throat?" he asked as Lillian stirred. She touched the bruises gingerly. "I've had worse." "Let me see." He examined the damage with clinical detachment, fingers gentle as they probed for deeper injury. "Swelling's minimal, you were lucky." "Skilled," she corrected. "My father taught us to protect our throats when fighting. Said a raccoon once survived 3 days in his trap because it kept its neck arched away from the pressure." "Smart man, your father." Jed handed her a canteen. "Drink slowly." They ate quickly and broke camp with practiced efficiency, leaving minimal trace of their presence. The horses had recovered somewhat overnight, though both still showed signs of the previous day's hard riding. "We'll need to pace them carefully today," Jed noted as they mounted. "Push too hard and they'll founder beneath us." "How far to Dodge City?" 30 miles, give or take." Jed studied the horizon. "If we're lucky, we'll make it by nightfall." Luck, however, seemed determined to abandon them. They'd barely covered 5 miles when Jed reined in sharply, raising a hand for silence. Lillian tensed, listening, then heard what had alerted him, the distant thunder of approaching horses coming fast from the east. "Different group," Jed concluded grimly. "Probably sent to cut us off while the others followed our trail." He scanned their surroundings with tactical precision, assessing options. They were in open country now, rolling prairie with minimal cover, perfect for horsemen, disastrous for those trying to hide. "There," he decided, pointing northwest where the land rose toward a rocky ridge. "If we can reach those bluffs before they spot us, we might find defensible ground." They urged their tired mounts forward, pushing for speed while knowing every hoofbeat drew from reserves the animals couldn't afford to spend. The ridge seemed to recede before them, distance stretching like a cruel illusion as the sound of pursuit grew steadily louder. "They've seen us," Lillian called, glancing back to where dust clouds marked their hunter's approach. Jed's expression hardened. "Ride for the rocks. Don't stop for anything." They abandoned all pretense of caution, driving their horses at a full gallop across the open prairie. Lillian's mount, smaller but fresher, began to pull ahead. She looked back to see Jed's chestnut struggling, the previous day's exertions taking their toll. "Keep going," he shouted, seeing her hesitation. The first shots rang out, bullets kicking up dirt well behind them but closing the gap with each volley. Jed drew his rifle, turning in the saddle to return fire, not aiming to hit, but to force their pursuers to slow and seek cover. Lillian reached the rocky slope first, dismounting to lead her horse up the steep incline. She tied the exhausted animal in the shelter of a boulder, then moved to cover Jed's approach with her colt. He was still 100 yards out when his horse stumbled, nearly throwing him. The animal recovered but was clearly at the end of its strength. Jed slipped out from the saddle, slapping the horse's flank to send it running, while he continued on foot, zigzagging to present a more difficult target. Lillian fired methodically, forcing the approaching riders to scatter and slow their advance. Her aim was precise despite the distance, her father's lessons serving her well in this desperate moment. Jed reached the rocks beside her, breathing hard but steady. "Good shooting," he acknowledged, taking position behind a boulder. "How's your ammunition?" 6 shots left," she reported, "plus whatever's in the saddlebags." "Make them count." Jed assessed their situation with calculating eyes. 8 riders, well-armed, professional. "Not the same men from yesterday," Lillian observed. "No." Jed's expression darkened. "These are Paxton's elite, hired guns, not ranch hands." The approaching horsemen split into 2 groups, circling to flank the rocky outcropping from both sides. Their movements spoke of military precision. Men who had fought in organized combat, not just frontier skirmishes. "Former soldiers," Jed confirmed, reading her thoughts. "Confederate mostly, from the formation. Men who never quite adjusted to peace." He shifted position, moving to counter the flanking maneuver. "Stay low. Don't fire unless you have a clear shot at something non-lethal." "You still won't kill them?" Lillian asked incredulously. "Even now?" "Especially now." Jed checked his rifle sights. "The moment we cross that line, we become what Paxton already believes we are. Enemies to be eliminated, not witnesses to be silenced." The attack came with coordinated precision, covering fire from one group while the other advanced, leapfrogging forward, using the sparse cover available. Jed responded with calculated shots that disabled but didn't kill, forcing their attackers to adjust their strategy. For 20 tense minutes, the standoff continued, a deadly chess match where each side tested the other's resolve and resources. Lillian followed Jed's lead, her shooting disciplined and effective despite her dwindling ammunition. Then a bullet caught Jed in the side, spinning him against the rocks with a grunt of pain. Lillian moved to him immediately, pressing her bandana against the wound to stem the bleeding. "Just a graze," he insisted through clenched teeth. A graze that's bleeding like a stuck pig, she countered, helping him to better cover. We can't hold this position much longer. Jed nodded grimly, acknowledging the reality of their situation. Their ammunition was nearly depleted, their horses exhausted, and now he was wounded. The tactical equation was shifting rapidly against them. There's a ravine beyond that rise, he said, gesturing to their right. Flash flood carved it out years ago. Follows a meandering path northwest. Toward Dodge City? Eventually. He winced as she tightened the makeshift bandage. It's our best chance. Narrow enough that they can't bring their horses in, can't flank us easily. Lillian assessed the distance to the ravine, nearly 200 yards of exposed ground. They'll cut us down before we're halfway there. Not if we give them something else to worry about. Jed reached into his saddlebag, withdrawing a small package wrapped in oilcloth. Dynamite, he explained at her surprised look. Kept it for stump removal. That's not stump removal, Bond, she observed dryly. Principles are adaptable. He worked quickly despite his injury, fashioning a simple timer using his pocket watch and a length of slow-burning fuse. When this blows, we run. Don't look back. Don't stop. Just run. Lillian nodded, mentally preparing herself for what might be their final desperate gambit. Jed positioned the makeshift bomb carefully, then lit the fuse. 20 seconds, he warned, gathering himself for the sprint. The explosion, when it came, was more impressive than either had anticipated. The dynamite detonated with a thunderous roar, sending rocks and debris skyward in a spectacular display that momentarily stunned their attackers. They ran through the case, Jed's wound forgotten in the desperate sprint for safety. Bullets kicked up dirt around them as their pursuers recovered and resumed firing. But the confusion had bought them the precious seconds they needed. They tumbled into the ravine together, sliding down its steep sides to the relatively protected channel below. Without pausing, Jed led them along the winding path, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and their pursuers before the advantage of surprise faded. The ravine proved both blessing and curse. Its narrow walls provided cover from gunfire, but the uneven terrain made progress slow and treacherous. Jed moved with grim determination despite his injury, his breathing increasingly labored as blood continued to seep through his makeshift bandage. Behind them, shouts indicated their pursuers had reached the ravine and were following on foot. The sounds echoed confusingly off the stone walls, making it difficult to gauge distance. There, Jed pointed ahead where the ravine widened slightly before splitting into two branches. Right fork narrows to a bottleneck. Good place for an ambush. They reached the junction and took the right branch as planned. 50 yards in, the ravine narrowed dramatically between two massive boulders, a natural choke point where they could make a stand. Jed positioned Lillian behind the larger boulder, then took cover opposite her. Count your rounds, he instructed, checking his own weapon. 3 shots left, he reported grimly. 4, Lillian replied, plus my knife. When they come through, Jed continued, aim for the first 2. I'll take the ones behind. If we're lucky, the rest will reconsider their options. And if we're not lucky, Jed's expression was answer enough. The minutes stretched with excruciating slowness, the only sounds their labored breathing and the distant calls of their pursuers as they searched the branching ravine. Jed used the time to properly bind his wound, movements precise despite the awkward angle. Tell me about your son, Lillian said suddenly, breaking the tense silence. Jed looked up, surprised by the non sequitur. Samuel? Yes. Her eyes remained fixed on the ravine entrance, but her voice softened. What was he like? Jed was silent so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice carried an emotion she hadn't heard before. Curious about everything, he said finally. Always asking why, never satisfied with simple answers. Martha said he got that from me. He wanted to be a doctor too. Thought he did. A ghost of a smile crossed Jed's face. But he loved animals more than people. Wanted to be a veterinarian. Had a way with even the most difficult horses. He sounds wonderful, Lillian offered. He was. Jed's expression darkened. He'd be 17 now, a man, not the boy I remember. Before Lillian could respond, a sound from the ravine entrance silenced them both. The scrape of boots on stone approaching cautiously. They tensed, weapons ready, waiting for their pursuers to enter the trap. The first man appeared, rifle leading the way, moving with the careful precision of an experienced fighter. Behind him, a second man covered his advance, both scanning the narrow passage for danger. Jed and Lillian held their fire, waiting for the optimal moment when both men would be fully exposed. The tension stretched to breaking point as the men advanced another step, then another. "Hargrove!" a voice called suddenly from behind the advancing men. "Dr. Jedediah Hargrove! I know you're there!" Jed froze, recognition flashing across his features. "Who is that?" Lillian whispered. "Captain Thomas Randall," Jed replied, voice tight with surprise. "We served together. Union Army." "You've got wounded men back here, Doctor," Randall called again. "One likely to bleed out without proper attention." Jed's expression contorted with internal conflict, the tactician warring with the healer. "Could be a trick," he muttered, though doubt had already crept into his voice. "I'm coming forward unarmed," Randall announced, "just to talk." True to his word, a man appeared beyond the first two scouts, hands held high and empty. He was in his 50s, with a close-cropped gray beard and the weathered features of someone accustomed to command. "Been a long time, Jed," he called, stopping at a respectful distance. 20-odd years by my count. "Randall," Jed kept his rifle raised. "Strange place for a reunion. Strange circumstances, too." Randall's eyes flicked to Lillian, then back to Jed. "Never thought I'd be hunting the Angel of Antietam." Lillian glanced at Jed, noting his reaction to the unfamiliar title. Something like shame crossed his features before being quickly suppressed. "What are you doing with Paxton?" Jed demanded. "Making a living," Randall replied simply. "War ended. Union Army didn't have much use for men like us afterward. Paxton pays well and asks few questions." "He's a murderer," Jed stated flatly. "As are we all, in our fashion." Randall's gaze was unwavering. "You more than most, if memory serves." The accusation hung in the air between them, charged with history Lillian couldn't fully comprehend. She watched Jed struggle with something internal, something that made his right hand tremble visibly on his rifle. "I have a man dying back there," Randall continued, his tone softening slightly. "Gut shot. Won't last the hour without proper attention. You were the best field surgeon in the Army of the Potomac. And you think I'll help you so you can continue hunting us?" Jed's voice was incredulous. "I think you'll help because that's who you are, Randall countered. The man who treated enemy wounded when others wouldn't. The doctor who crossed lines to save lives others had written off." Jed's jaw clenched, his internal conflict visible in every line of his body. "Even if I wanted to," he said finally, "I haven't the proper supplies." "Yes, you do." Randall's certainty was unshakable. "You never travel without your medical kit. Not the Jed Hargrove I knew." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the wind whistling through the ravine walls. Lillian watched the man she thought she was coming to know wrestle with ghosts from a past she hadn't fully understood until this moment. "1 hour," Jed decided abruptly. "I'll treat your wounded. Then we go our separate ways. No pursuit, no further bloodshed." "Jed," Lillian protested, "you can't trust him." "I don't," Jed assured her quietly. "But I can't let a man die if I might save him. That's a line I won't cross again." Randall nodded solemnly. "My word as an officer, 1 hour, then you're free to go." "Your word meant something once," Jed acknowledged, lowering his rifle. "Let's hope it still does." As they prepared to follow Randall back through the ravine, Lillian caught Jed's arm. "This is a mistake," she whispered urgently. "They'll never let us reach Dodge City." "Probably not," Jed agreed, surprising her with his candor. "But this buys us time and information. And sometimes," he added with a grim smile that didn't reach his eyes, "the only way out is through." They emerged from the narrow passage into the wider section of the ravine where Randall's men had established a makeshift camp. 8 riders had become 6, one lying pale and still on a bedroll, another sitting nearby clutching a blood-soaked bandage to his thigh. All eyes turned to them as they approached, expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. Jed ignored them, moving directly to the wounded man on the ground. "What happened?" he asked Randall, already kneeling to examine the injury. "Your dynamite," Randall explained. "Jefferson was too close when it blew. Took shrapnel to the gut." Jed worked quickly, cutting away clothing to reveal the wound. An ugly, ragged tear in the lower abdomen that leaked blood and worse. His expression told Lillian everything she needed to know about the man's chances. I need hot water, he instructed, voice shifting to the authoritative tone of a surgeon accustomed to battlefield conditions. Clean cloth, whiskey if you have it, and someone to assist. To Lillian's surprise, Randall himself stepped forward. I'll assist. Served as your orderly more than once, if you recall. As Jed began working to save the life of the man who had been trying to kill them mere hours ago, Lillian found herself wondering about the complex history between these two men. What had Jed been during the war that inspired such respect from a hardened commander like Randall? What had he done to earn the title Angel of Antietam that seemed to carry such weight? Most importantly, what did it mean that a man like Hiram Paxton could command the loyalty of former Union officers? The implications sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cool air of the ravine. One of Randall's men approached her, offering a canteen. Ma'am, he said with surprising courtesy. She accepted it cautiously, watching him from the corner of her eye as she drank. He was younger than the others, perhaps 30, with a livid scar running from temple to jaw on the left side of his face. Morgan, he introduced himself simply. Ezra Morgan. Lillian Thorne, she replied, seeing no reason to hide her identity from men who already knew who they were hunting. Thorne, Morgan repeated thoughtfully. Any relation to Judge Raymond Thorne? Lillian tensed, immediately on guard. Why do you ask? Just curious. Morgan's expression revealed nothing. Judge has a reputation for fairness, even among those who find themselves on the wrong side of his bench. Before Lillian could respond, a commotion from where Jed was working drew their attention. The wounded man had begun convulsing, his body arching despite Randall's attempts to hold him steady. Jed worked with desperate intensity, hands moving with precision even as blood pooled around his knees. Pressure here, he instructed Randall sharply. More light. Someone bring a lamp closer. Another man hurried forward with a lantern, illuminating the grisly scene in stark detail. Lillian watched Jed's face as he fought to save the dying man, his expression a study in focused determination, eyes clear and certain despite the chaos around him. This, she realized, was the man he had been before trauma and loss had reshaped him, the healer at his core, the man who valued life above all other considerations. For all his skill with weapons, for all his capacity for violence. This was his true element. The convulsions stopped abruptly, the wounded man going limp beneath Jed's bloodied hands. For several tense moments, the only sound was the labored breathing of the injured man, ragged but continuing. He'll live? Randall asked quietly. If infection doesn't set in, Jed replied, sitting back on his heels. He needs proper care, not field medicine. Get him to a doctor in Dodge City. Dr. Samuel Wilson. Tell him I sent you. You know doctors in Dodge? Lillian asked, surprised. I know doctors everywhere, Jed replied, rising stiffly. His own wound had begun bleeding again, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Professional courtesy transcends personal differences. Randall offered a hand to help Jed stand, which he accepted after a moment's hesitation. Your hour's up, doctor, Randall noted. A deal's a deal. So it is. Jed gathered his medical supplies, movements deliberate despite his obvious fatigue. We'll be going now. One moment, Randall signaled to Morgan, who disappeared briefly into the gathering dusk, returning with 2 fresh horses. Your mounts are spent. Take these. Jed eyed the animal suspiciously. Why? Professional courtesy, Randall echoed Jed's earlier words, and perhaps a debt repaid. You saved my life at Cold Harbor. Seems only fair I save yours now. Tension crackled between them, decades of history compressed into a single moment of reckoning. Finally, Jed nodded once, acknowledgement rather than gratitude. What will you tell Paxton? He asked as they mounted. That we lost your trail in the ravine, Randall replied. It won't hold for long, but it might buy you a day. Make it count. As they rode away, Lillian glanced back to see Randall watching them, his expression unreadable in the fading light. Something about the encounter had shaken her confidence, left her questioning assumptions she hadn't realized she was making. Can we trust him? She asked when they were beyond earshot. Randall? Jed considered the question seriously. Yes and no, he'll honor his word for today. Tomorrow? He shrugged. Tomorrow he works for Paxton. You served with him? Under him, Jed corrected. He commanded a special detachment, men with particular skills. Like yours? Jed's silence was answer enough. They rode northwest as dusk deepened into night, the stars emerging above them like silent witnesses to their journey. Both were lost in their own thoughts. Lillian trying to reconcile the different facets of the man beside her, Jed wrestling with ghosts the encounter had awakened. "The angel of Antietam," she said finally, breaking the silence. "What did he mean by that?" Jed's expression closed like a door shutting. "A name I don't deserve." "Tell me anyway," she pressed gently. He rode in silence for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he did, his voice was distant, as if reciting someone else's story. "After the battle, I worked 3 days straight in the field hospital. Union, Confederate, didn't matter to me. Some called it treason to save enemy lives with the same care as our own. Others called it divine mercy." His laugh was bitter, empty of humor. "I was neither traitor nor angel, just a doctor doing his job." "That doesn't explain Randall's respect," Lillian observed, "or why Paxton would hold a grudge after all these years." Jed's hand tightened on the reins, his knuckles white in the moonlight. "Some stories are better left untold, Miss Thorne." "Not if they might get us killed," she countered. "I need to know what we're really facing." The logic of her argument penetrated his resistance. Jed sighed, a sound heavy with reluctance and old regret. "After Antietam, the war changed," he began slowly. "Became something uglier, more personal. Commands came down, special operations behind enemy lines. Surgical strikes, they called them. And you were part of this?" "I was the surgeon attached to Randall's unit," Jed confirmed. "But surgery wasn't all I did. My medical knowledge made me uniquely qualified for certain tasks." The implication hung in the night air between them, chilling despite the mild evening. Lillian began to understand the shadows that haunted this man, the ghost that made his hand tremble at unexpected moments. "Paxton was one of your targets," she guessed. "No," Jed corrected. "Paxton was one of my patients. A man I chose not to save when I had the chance. A decision that violated everything I believed about medicine, about my purpose." "You were at war," Lillian offered, echoing his earlier words to her. "War explains," Jed repeated, "but doesn't excuse." He straightened in the saddle, visibly putting the memories away. "We should make Dodge City by morning if we maintain this pace. Try to rest in the saddle if you can." As they continued through the night, Lillian found herself watching Jed with new understanding. The contradiction that had puzzled her, the healer who fought with lethal precision, the gentle doctor with a killer's instincts, began to make a terrible kind of sense. He wasn't two separate men at war within himself. He was a single man who had been forced to become both, and who had never fully reconciled the moral cost of that transformation. Ahead of them, the horizon remained dark, Dodge City still hours away. Behind them, the past pursued with relentless determination, refusing to remain buried despite all efforts to leave it behind. Between them rode the ghosts of choices made and unmade, lives saved and lost, and the terrible weight of a debt that could only be settled in blood or forgiveness. Dodge City materialized from the plains like a mirage at dawn. First a smudge on the horizon, then a jumble of buildings that grew more distinct with each passing mile. Founded as a frontier outpost and transformed by the cattle trade, it had evolved into a hub of commerce, vice, and uneasy civilization on the edge of the wilderness. Jed and Lillian approached with caution, staying off the main roads. Their night ride had been punishing, and both showed signs of severe fatigue. Jed's wound had stopped bleeding, but left him pale and rigid with pain. Lillian's bruised throat had darkened to an ugly purple, making each swallow an exercise in determination. "We can't ride directly into town," Jed said, reining in his horse atop a small rise that afforded a view of the city. "Paxton will have men watching the main approaches." "Where then?" Lillian asked, her voice raspy from exhaustion and injury. Jed pointed west of the city proper. "Wilson's place, the doctor I mentioned. His homestead is about 2 miles outside town. Can he be trusted?" "He owes me his life," Jed replied simply. "That usually counts for something." They circled wide around Dodge City, approaching Wilson's property from the west, where a modest 2-story house stood surrounded by cottonwood trees. A smaller building nearby served as both office and surgery, identifiable by the discreet sign advertising Dr. S. Wilson, physician and surgeon. As they dismounted, the front door opened to reveal a man in his 60s with silver hair and spectacles perched on a prominent nose. He observed them with clinical interest, taking in their exhausted state and obvious injuries. "Trouble follows you like a shadow, Hargrove," he remarked dryly. "Nature of the beast, Sam," Jed replied. "We need shelter, just for a day or two." Wilson's gaze shifted to Lillian, noting the bruises around her throat. "The young lady requires attention." "As does he," Lillian said, indicating Jed's blood-stained shirt. "Bullet wound. He's being stubborn about it." "Some things never change," Wilson sighed, gesturing them inside. "Come on, then. Let's patch you both up before you collapse on my doorstep." The interior of Wilson's home was unexpectedly refined for frontier living. Well-crafted furniture, tasteful paintings, and bookshelves lined with medical texts and classical literature. He led them to a small examination room adjacent to the kitchen where medical supplies were neatly arranged. "Shirt off," he instructed Jed, washing his hands in a basin. "Let's see the damage." Yet Jed complied with the resigned attitude of a doctor forced to become a patient. The wound in his side looked worse in the clear morning light, an angry furrow where the bullet had carved a path through flesh without striking anything vital, but deep enough to require proper stitching. Wilson cleaned and examined it with brisk efficiency. "You've been riding with this, untreated?" "Had other priorities," Jed replied. "Yes, you always do." Wilson threaded a suture needle. "Hold still. This will sting." Jed didn't flinch as the needle pierced skin, his expression stoic despite the pain. Lillian watched with a mixture of concern and admiration, noting how his right hand clenched into a fist with each stitch, controlling the tremor through sheer force of will. When Wilson finished with Jed, he turned his attention to Lillian, examining her throat and the various cuts and abrasions from their flight. "Nothing broken," he concluded, "but you both need rest. And food. And probably a better explanation than whatever half-truth Hargrove has prepared." "Sam," Jed began, but Wilson cut him off with a raised hand. "Save it for after breakfast. You look like you're about to drop, and I make it a policy not to interrogate patients on empty stomachs." True to his word, Wilson prepared a substantial breakfast while Jed and Lillian cleaned up as best they could. The hot food revived them somewhat, though exhaustion remained etched in the shadows beneath their eyes. "Now," Wilson said as they finished eating, "suppose you tell me why you're showing up at dawn with bullet wounds and a woman who looks like she's been strangled." Jed glanced at Lillian, who nodded, permission to share their situation. "Her name is Lillian Thorne," Jed began, "sister of federal Judge Raymond Thorne." Wilson's eyebrows rose. "The same Judge Thorne who's been investigating corruption in the cattle industry?" "The same," Lillian confirmed. "I was held captive by Hiram Paxton for months. When I escaped, I took evidence of his crimes with me." "Paxton," Wilson repeated, gaze shifting to Jed. "So it always comes back to him." "You know about Paxton?" Lillian asked, surprised. "Everyone in Dodge knows Paxton," Wilson replied grimly. "His influence reaches far beyond his own property. But what Sam knows," he continued, using Jed's first name deliberately, "is something more personal, isn't it?" Jed's expression darkened. "Ancient history." "Not so ancient if he's still hunting you." Wilson turned back to Lillian. "Judge Thorne is scheduled to arrive tomorrow on the morning train. It's been announced in the paper, some kind of formal hearing about cattle rustling and land disputes." "Then Paxton already knows," Jed concluded. "If it's public knowledge, he'll have had time to prepare." "Prepare what?" Wilson asked. Lillian exchanged a worried glance with Jed. "When I escaped, I overheard Paxton discussing plans to ambush my brother. I think he means to kill him before the hearing can proceed." Wilson absorbed this with the gravity it deserved. That would be unprecedented. Killing a federal judge is a hanging offense that even Paxton's influence couldn't shield him from. "Unless there's no evidence connecting him to the crime," Jed pointed out, "Paxton never does his own dirty work." "And the evidence you took?" Wilson asked Lillian. She withdrew the small ledger from her bodice, placing it carefully on the table. "Pages from his account book. Names, dates, amounts paid for bribes and assassinations. Proof of cattle rustling operations across 3 territories." Wilson whistled softly. "No wonder he wants you back." "We need to warn Raymond," Lillian said urgently, "and get this evidence to the proper authorities." "The U.S. Marshal would be your best bet," Wilson suggested. "Walter Kavanaugh." He's new to the position but has a reputation for integrity. Can you get a message to him? Jed asked. Discreetly? I can try. Wilson rose from the table. In the meantime, you both need rest. There's a spare bedroom upstairs and a sofa in my study. Make yourselves at home while I see what I can arrange. Exhaustion finally caught up with them as the immediate crisis eased. Lillian took the bedroom while Jed settled in the study, both falling into the deep sleep of the physically and emotionally depleted. When Lillian woke, afternoon sunlight streamed through the curtains. She found fresh clothing laid out, a simple but well-made dress that was only slightly too large, likely belonging to Wilson's absent wife or daughter. The thoughtful gesture brought unexpected tears to her eyes, a reminder of civilized kindnesses she'd nearly forgotten. Downstairs, she found Jed and Wilson in deep conversation, both looking up as she entered. Good news and bad news, Wilson announced without preamble. The good, I've arranged a meeting with Marshal Kavanaugh for this evening. The bad, Paxton's men are in town more than usual. They're asking questions, showing your descriptions around. Then we stay hidden until the meeting, Jed decided. There's more. Wilson's expression grew troubled. Judge Thorne's train was delayed. Telegraph came in an hour ago. He won't arrive until late tomorrow night. Lillian's face fell. That gives Paxton more time to prepare. Or us more time to counter him, Jed suggested. What else have you heard, Sam? Rumors, mostly. Paxton's brought in additional men, professionals, not just ranch hands. And there's talk about a special passenger arriving on tonight's train from Topeka. What kind of special passenger? Lillian asked. No one seems to know, Wilson admitted. But whatever Paxton's planning, it's happening soon. Jed paced the room, his military mind analyzing variables, calculating risks. We need more information. Going in blind to meet the marshal could be walking into a trap. You think Kavanaugh is compromised? Wilson asked, alarmed. I think assuming anyone isn't compromised is dangerous, Jed replied. No offense, Sam. Wilson waved this away. None taken. Caution's kept you alive this long. I should go into town, Jed decided. Listen at the saloons. Get a feel for what's happening. You'd be recognized immediately, Lillian protested. Not necessarily. Wilson considered Jed thoughtfully. It's been 7 years since you've been in Dodge proper. Grow back your beard, change your clothes, walk with a limp might be enough to pass a casual inspection. It's too risky, Lillian insisted. Everything about this is risky, Jed countered. But information is our best weapon right now. The argument continued until they reached a compromise. Jed would go into town disguised as Wilson's assistant, ostensibly to pick up medical supplies. He would limit his reconnaissance to public spaces and return before dark when they would meet the marshal together. Wilson provided suitable clothing and helped Jed enhance his disguise with strategic padding that altered his silhouette and a walking stick that changed his gait. The transformation was remarkable. The straight-backed, alert former soldier becoming a stooped, unremarkable older man who might pass unnoticed in any frontier town. Be careful, Lillian said as he prepared to leave with Wilson. Paxton's men are trained to notice details. So am I, Jed replied, his voice pitched higher as part of his disguise. Trust the training. After they departed, Lillian found herself alone in Wilson's home, the silence oppressive after days of constant vigilance and movement. She used the time to properly clean herself and tend to her various injuries, grateful for the civilized comforts of hot water and clean bandages. Her thoughts turned to Raymond, imagining his concern during the months of her disappearance. The forged letters Paxton had forced her to write would have raised suspicions eventually. Raymond knew her too well to be fooled for long. He would have been searching, perhaps putting his own investigation at risk to find her. The sound of approaching horses snapped her from these reflections. Peering cautiously through the curtains, she saw 3 riders approaching the house. Men she didn't recognize, but whose bearing and weapons identified them clearly as Paxton's. Heart racing, Lillian quickly gathered her few possessions, including the precious ledger pages. Wilson had shown her a hidden cellar accessed through a trap door in the pantry, a relic from earlier, more dangerous days when the house had occasionally needed to serve as a fortress against raids. She slipped into the cramped space just as the first knock sounded at the front door. From her hiding place, she could hear muffled voices as the men apparently spoke to someone, a housekeeper or assistant Wilson hadn't mentioned. The voices grew louder as the men entered the house, their heavy boots creaking on the floorboards above. Lillian held her breath as they moved methodically through the rooms, searching. "Doctor said no one's been here," one voice insisted. "Paxton says check anyway," another replied. "He's paying enough for thoroughness." The pantry door opened, footsteps directly above her hiding place. Lillian pressed herself against the earthen wall, praying the trapdoor wasn't visible to casual inspection. Something heavy slid across the floor. A sack of flour or sugar being moved. The trapdoor creaked slightly under the pressure. Lillian's hand moved to the Colt revolver she'd kept with her, preparing for discovery. But the footsteps moved away, the pantry door closing as the search continued elsewhere. Minutes stretched into an eternity before she finally heard the men leave, their horses' hoofbeats fading into the distance. Lillian remained hidden, unwilling to risk emergence until Jed and Wilson returned. The cellar was cool and damp, smelling of earth and root vegetables stored for winter. In the dim light filtering through cracks in the trapdoor, she examined the ledger pages again, ensuring they remained intact. The information they contained was damning. Systematic records of bribes paid to officials ranging from local sheriffs to territorial judges, cattle stolen and rebranded, competitors driven off or eliminated. Most disturbing were the clinical entries recording payments for permanent solutions to various problems, the euphemism barely disguising the murders Paxton had commissioned. Her brother's name appeared in later entries, initially as an obstacle to be bribed, then as a problem requiring more permanent resolution. The cold calculation with which Paxton documented his crimes chilled her more deeply than any physical threat. Hours passed before she heard Wilson's wagon returning. Even then, she waited until Jed's distinctive knock, 3 short, 2 long, signaled safety before emerging from her hiding place. Paxton's men were here, she reported immediately, 3 of them, searching the house. Wilson's face darkened with anger. Entering a doctor's home uninvited. The presumption. "Did they find anything?" Jed asked, already checking that the windows were secured. "No, I hid in the cellar." Lillian brushed dust from her skirt. "What did you learn in town?" Jed's expression was grim. "Plenty, none of it good. Paxton's operation is larger than we thought. He's bought half the county officials and scared the other half into silence." "And the special passenger?" Wilson prompted. "A specialist from St. Louis," Jed explained. "Former Pinkerton detective turned hired gun. Expert marksman with a reputation for difficult assassinations." "For Raymond," Lillian concluded, fear tightening her chest. "Most likely." Jed removed his disguise, revealing the strain of the day and the tightness around his eyes. "But there's more. I visited the telegraph office, claiming to collect messages for you, Sam." "Clever," Wilson acknowledged. "What did you find?" "A telegram for the sheriff, sent in code but poorly disguised. It mentioned package delivery tomorrow evening at Snake River Crossing. That's where the train crosses before reaching Dodge," Wilson explained for Lillian's benefit. "The perfect place for an ambush," Jed added. "Remote, limited visibility, train has to slow significantly for the curve." "We have to warn Raymond," Lillian insisted. "Already attempted," Wilson assured her. "I sent a wire to the last station before Snake River, but there's no guarantee he'll receive it in time." "Then we need to be there," Lillian decided, "at the crossing when the train comes through." Jed nodded, his tactical mind already formulating plans. "We'll need help. The marshal—" "That's our next problem," Wilson interrupted. "Marshal Kavanaugh sent word he can't meet us tonight. Convenient emergency out of town." "Paxton," Jed concluded grimly. "Most likely," Wilson agreed, "which leaves us rather short on allies." "Not necessarily," Jed mused, an idea forming. "Randall." "The man who was hunting us?" Lillian asked incredulously. "He gave us those horses when he could have captured us," Jed reminded her. "There's still honor there buried under mercenary practicality." "You're suggesting we ask Paxton's own men to help us stop Paxton?" Wilson couldn't hide his skepticism. "Not all of them," Jed clarified. "Just Randall and perhaps 1 or 2 he trusts. Men who served in the Union Army, who might balk at assassinating a federal judge regardless of their current employer." "It's insane," Lillian protested. "It's our best option," Jed countered. "Without the marshal, we're outnumbered and outgunned. We need allies, even unlikely ones." "And how do you propose to contact Randall without getting yourself killed?" Wilson asked pragmatically. Jed smiled thinly. Through the wounded man I treated in the ravine, Jefferson. If Randall followed my advice, he'd have brought him to Dr. Malcolm's surgery in town. Malcolm's a drunk, Wilson scoffed. But his nurse isn't, Jed replied. Sarah Holloway. She served with Clara Barton during the war. She'd recognize my handwriting. Keep a message confidential. The plan took shape quickly. Wilson would visit Malcolm's surgery professionally, delivering a sealed note for Randall through Nurse Holloway. If Randall was amenable, he would meet them at Wilson's farm after dark. This is dangerous ground, Hargrove, Wilson warned as he prepared to return to town. Trusting a man who's been hunting you. Sometimes the devil you know is better than the one you don't, Jed replied philosophically. Besides, we're short on options and time. After Wilson departed, Jed and Lillian spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for all contingencies. They cleaned and checked their weapons, studied a detailed map of the Snake River crossing area, and discussed various scenarios for intercepting Paxton's assassination attempt. If Randall refuses, Lillian asked as the sun began to set. Then we proceed alone, Jed replied matter-of-factly. It won't be the first time I've faced unfavorable odds. Why are you doing this? The question had been building in her for days. You could have turned me away at your farm, could have handed me over to Paxton's men, could have let me die as I asked. Why risk everything for a stranger? Jed was silent for a long moment, watching the last sunlight fade from the western windows. Because 20 years ago, I made choices that haunt me still, he said finally. Chose expediency over oath, vengeance over healing. Martha helped me find my way back, showed me there was still good in me worth salvaging. He turned to face Lillian directly. When you appeared at my farm, I saw a chance to honor her memory, to be the man she believed that I could be, not the one the war created. And Paxton? Paxton is the road not taken, Jed said quietly. What I might have become if Martha hadn't found me. A man so consumed by past injuries that he's willing to destroy anything in pursuit of what he believes he's owed. The simple honesty of his answer touched Lillian deeply. She reached across the table to cover his trembling right hand with her own. For what it's worth, I think Martha would be proud of the man you are now. Something vulnerable and raw flickered in Jed's eyes before he carefully withdrew his hand, the moment of connection passing as quickly as it had formed. Wilson returned after nightfall, his expression conveying news before he spoke. Randall will meet us, midnight, at the old mill by the creek. Not here? Lillian asked, suspicious. He's being cautious, Jed explained. The mill offers better visibility, multiple escape routes. It's what I would choose. He's coming alone, Wilson added. Said to tell you it's like Sharpsburg, whatever that means. It means he's taking a personal risk, Jed translated. At Sharpsburg, what they called Antietam in the South, Randall crossed lines alone to negotiate wounded exchanges under flag of truce. Nearly got shot by both sides for his trouble. Preparations for the midnight meeting proceeded with military precision. Jed insisted on scouting the location first, returning with a detailed assessment of approaches and potential ambush points. Wilson contributed his knowledge of local terrain, while Lillian studied the map, memorizing alternative routes and natural features that might provide cover if needed. As midnight approached, they rode out together, Jed and Lillian to the meeting, Wilson remaining behind to treat any wounded who might result from the confrontation with Paxton's forces. The old mill stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its broken wheel hanging uselessly over the shallow creek that had once powered it. The building itself was partially collapsed, roof beams exposed like the ribs of some giant skeleton. They approached cautiously, Jed taking point while Lillian covered their rear, both alert for any sign of betrayal. The soft nickering of a horse revealed Randall's position before they saw him, a solitary figure waiting beside the crumbling stone foundation. Hargrove, he greeted as they dismounted. Miss Thorne. Randall, Jed acknowledged, keeping his distance. You came alone. As promised, Randall gestured to the open area around him. No ambush, no reinforcements, just a conversation between old comrades. We were never comrades, Jed corrected mildly. You commanded, I followed orders. Close enough in war. Randall's weathered face revealed nothing of his thoughts. Your message mentioned Judge Thorne and an assassination plot. Paxton plans to ambush the judge's train at Snake River Crossing tomorrow evening, Jed confirmed. He's brought in a specialist from St. Louis for the job. Graves, Randall nodded. I met him this morning. Cold piece of work. Then you know what we're facing, Lillian interjected. My brother is a federal judge. Killing him won't just be murder. It'll bring the full weight of the government down on whoever's responsible. Which won't be Paxton officially, Randall pointed out. He's too careful for that. The specialist will be found dead from a convenient accident, all connections severed. You know how he operates, Jed observed, yet you still work for him. Randall's expression hardened. The war ended, Hargrove. Union Army had no use for men with our particular talents. Paxton pays well and asks few questions. He's a murderer, Lillian said flatly. As are we all, in our fashion, Randall replied, echoing his words from their previous encounter. You more than most, Doctor. The accusation hung between them, charged with history and shared knowledge. Jed didn't deny it, his silence more damning than any protest could have been. I'm not asking you to betray Paxton, Jed said finally. Just to stand aside, let us stop the assassination. And if I refuse, Randall asked. Then we'll try anyway, Jed replied simply. But the odds decrease significantly. Randall studied them both, calculation evident in his gaze. Why should I risk my position? Paxton's operation is profitable, stable. What are you offering that competes with that? The right side of history, Lillian suggested. Randall laughed, the sound devoid of humor. History is written by survivors, Miss Thorne. I've found profit a more reliable companion than righteousness. How about survival itself, Jed countered. Lillian has evidence linking Paxton directly to multiple murders, bribery of officials, and organized rustling across 3 territories. When that evidence reaches the proper authorities, and it will, anyone connected to his operation will hang alongside him. Unless they've helped bring him down, Lillian added, understanding Jed's strategy. Randall's interest sharpened visibly. You have proof? Actual documentation? Lillian patted the hidden pocket where she kept the ledger pages. Enough to hang him 20 times over. Let me see it, Randall demanded. Not a chance, Jed refused immediately. That's our insurance. Randall considered this impasse, then nodded slowly. Prudent. I'd have been suspicious if you'd shown it too easily. He paced a few steps, weighing options. What exactly are you proposing? Information primarily, Jed explained. How many men Paxton has assigned to the ambush, their positions, the exact timing. We need to know what we're facing. And in return, when this is over, we testify that you assisted the investigation, Lillian offered. Your name stays clean when Paxton falls. Not much of a guarantee, Randall observed. Better than what Paxton's offering, Jed countered. Once the judge is dead and the specialist eliminated, how long before Paxton decides other loose ends need trimming? Men who know too much about an operation that killed a federal judge? The implication wasn't lost on Randall. His expression darkened as he recognized the truth in Jed's assessment. There's something else, Jed continued, playing his final card. The specialist Graves, he's not just here for the judge. Meaning, Randall asked, suddenly alert. Paxton mentioned a secondary target when he spoke with the sheriff, Jed lied smoothly. Someone whose knowledge makes them a liability regardless of loyalty. Randall's face remained impassive, but something shifted in his eyes. The first flicker of doubt about his employer's trustworthiness. I'll need to consider this, he said finally. We don't have time, Lillian pressed. The train arrives tomorrow evening. Then you'll have my answer by noon tomorrow, Randall replied firmly. Same location, same terms. Alone. It was the best they could hope for. Jed nodded agreement, and they parted ways with the tension of unfinished business hanging between them. Do you think he'll help? Lillian asked as they rode back to Wilson's homestead. 50-50, Jed assessed. Randall's a survivor above all else. If he decides Paxton is the greater threat to his continued existence, he'll side with us. And if not? Then we adapt, Jed replied with the pragmatism of a man accustomed to shifting circumstances. One way or another, we'll be at that crossing when your brother's train arrives. They returned to find Wilson waiting anxiously, relieved at their safe arrival. Over a late meal, they discussed the meeting and its implications, refining their plans for the coming confrontation. Even with Randall's help, You'll be outnumbered, Wilson pointed out. Quality over quantity, Jed countered. Most of Paxton's men are cowboys playing at being gunfighters, dangerous but undisciplined. Except for the specialist, Lillian reminded him. Except for him, Jed acknowledged. He'll be the primary threat. Their planning continued late into the night, each scenario examined and contingencies established. When they finally sought rest, dawn was already lightening the eastern sky. The day of reckoning had arrived. Lillian slept fitfully, dreams filled with trains and gunfire, and Raymond's face contorted in terror. She woke feeling scarcely rested, the weight of the coming confrontation pressing on her like a physical presence. Downstairs, she found Jed already awake, methodically cleaning his weapons at the kitchen table. His wound appeared to be healing well thanks to Wilson's care, and some of the exhaustion had faded from his features. "How long have you been up?" she asked, pouring herself coffee from the pot on the stove. "A while," he replied without elaborating. Wilson rode into town to check on his patients and gather any new information. They settled into companionable silence, Lillian reviewing the map of Snake River crossing once more, while Jed completed his weapons maintenance. The quiet domesticity of the scene belied the deadly purpose of their preparations. "If this goes wrong," Lillian said suddenly, "I want you to know how grateful I am. For everything." Jed looked up, his expression softening slightly. "It won't go wrong." "You can't promise that." "No," he admitted, "but I've learned to focus on what can be controlled, not what can't." "Is that how you survived after losing Martha and Samuel?" Lillian asked gently. "By controlling what you could?" Pain flickered across Jed's features before being carefully masked. "Partly, the rest was just breathing, one day at a time, finding reasons to continue." "And what were those reasons?" Jed's hand stilled on his revolver, the question penetrating deeper than he'd expected. "At first, just habit," he admitted, then anger, the need to find those responsible. "And after? After I found them?" Jed considered the question seriously. "I'm not sure. Perhaps the hope that living well would honor Martha's memory better than dying uselessly." Before Lillian could respond, hoofbeats announced Wilson's return. He entered looking troubled, hanging his hat on the peg by the door with unusual force. "Paxton's in town," he announced without preamble. "Arrived this morning with a dozen men. They're not even pretending to be subtle anymore." "That's significant," Jed observed. "Paxton rarely leaves his ranch, especially not with major operations pending." "Something's changed." "Perhaps he learned we're still alive," Lillian suggested. "Or he wants to personally ensure the assassination succeeds," Wilson offered grimly. "Either way, it complicates matters." Jed absorbed this new information, mentally adjusting their plans. "Did you see any sign of Randall?" "No," Wilson replied, "but I did see preparations. Extra horses at the livery stable, men checking rifles behind the saloon. They're mobilizing for something big." "The noon meeting with Randall becomes even more critical," Jed concluded. "We need to know exactly what we're facing." As noon approached, tension mounted. Jed prepared to depart for the rendezvous, checking his weapons one final time. "Be careful," Lillian urged. "If Paxton's in town, Randall might be compromised." "I'll approach with appropriate caution," Jed assured her. "If I'm not back by 2, assume the worst and proceed with the alternate plan." The alternate plan, a desperate last resort involving Wilson creating a diversion in town while Lillian and Jed attempted to reach the crossing ahead of Paxton's men, was one they all hoped to avoid. Jed departed, leaving Lillian and Wilson to continue preparations. They sorted medical supplies that might be needed, reviewed maps, and discussed contingencies until waiting became unbearable. "He should be back by now," Lillian said as the clock ticked past 1:30. "Give him time," Wilson counseled, though his own expression betrayed concern. "Negotiations like this can't be rushed." Another 30 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. At precisely 2 o'clock, Lillian rose decisively. "We need to implement the alternate plan." "Wait," Wilson cautioned, peering through the window. "Rider coming. Fast." They watched anxiously as the approaching horseman resolved into Jed's familiar figure, riding hard across the open ground toward the homestead. He dismounted in a fluid motion that belied his recent injury, expression grim as he entered the house. "Randall didn't show," he reported tersely, "but I found this nailed to the mill door." He handed Lillian a folded paper, The message inside written in a precise military hand. Snake River, 5 p.m. Graves plus 8 men positioned along East Ridge. Train scheduled 5:17. Primary target, first passenger car. Secondary target, you. Paxton observing from North Bluff. This squares us. R. He's helping us, Lillian realized, surprised. In his fashion, Jed agreed, providing information without directly involving himself. Plausible deniability if Paxton discovers his betrayal. Is it enough? Wilson asked. Jed studied the note again. It's specific, actionable. More than I expected, honestly. There's something else, Lillian pointed out, rereading the message. Secondary target, you. Randall thinks Paxton is targeting you specifically, Jed. Makes sense, Jed acknowledged with disturbing calm. I've become a liability, a connection to his past he'd rather eliminate. Plus, he likely blames me for your escape. This changes things, Wilson insisted. If you're a target, it changes nothing, Jed interrupted firmly. The plan remains. We reach the crossing before the ambush is fully set, disrupt their positions, and ensure the train passes safely. With Paxton himself present, Lillian added, this could be our chance to end this completely. The gravity of that possibility settled over them. If they succeeded, Paxton's reign of terror would end. If they failed, they would likely not survive to attempt another intervention. Final preparations moved with urgent efficiency. Wilson would remain at his homestead, preparing for potential casualties. Jed and Lillian would approach Snake River crossing separately, she from the south, where tree cover would provide concealment, he from the west, where the setting sun would obscure his approach. Remember, Jed instructed as they prepared to depart, our primary objective is protecting the train and your brother. Confronting Paxton is secondary. Understood, Lillian agreed, though the fire in her eyes suggested personal vengeance remained a powerful motivation. They departed mid-afternoon, allowing ample time to reach their positions before Paxton's men completed their preparations. The journey was tense but uneventful, each lost in their own thoughts as they approached what might well be their final confrontation. Snake River Crossing appeared as Randall's note had described, a curved section of track where the railroad spanned a narrow but deep river gorge. The eastern ridge provided perfect sniper positions overlooking the crossing, while the northern bluff offered an excellent vantage point for observation without direct involvement. Jed and Lillian separated as planned, each making their careful approach through different routes. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the landscape as the appointed hour drew near. From her position among the trees south of the crossing, Lillian could make out movement along the eastern ridge, men taking up positions, the occasional glint of sunlight on rifle barrels. Using her small field glass, she counted 8 figures spaced at intervals along the ridgeline, just as Randall had warned. She couldn't identify the specialist among them from this distance, but assumed the central figure, positioned for the clearest shot at the train, would be Graves. Shifting her glass northward, she scanned the bluff where Paxton was supposed to be observing. There, 2 horses and 2 men, one standing with a larger field glass trained on the crossing. Even at this distance, Lillian recognized the distinctive posture of Hiram Paxton, the man who had imprisoned her, branded her, and tried to use her as leverage against her brother. Rage threatened to overwhelm her careful control. How easy it would be to change the plan, to approach the bluff and end Paxton's life with a single well-placed shot. The cold at her hips seemed to grow heavier with possibility. Movement to the west caught her attention. Jed making his careful approach, using the scrub brush as cover as he advanced toward the crossing. His discipline reminded her of their purpose. Save Raymond first, then deal with Paxton. The distant whistle of an approaching train shattered the tense silence. Earlier than scheduled, either a deliberate change to avoid the ambush or simple railroad inefficiency. Either way, it forced their hand. Jed immediately changed tactics, abandoning stealth for speed as he raced toward the nearest gunman's position. Lillian followed his lead, emerging from the trees to target the men closest to her position. The element of surprise gave them a momentary advantage. Jed reached the first gunman before he could properly react, disarming him with practiced efficiency. Lillian's first shot caught another in the shoulder, sending his rifle clattering down the rocky slope. But the advantage was brief. The remaining gunman, alerted by the commotion, turned their attention from the approaching train to the unexpected threat. Bullets peppered the ground around Lillian as she dove for cover behind a boulder. Jed was fully exposed on the open slope, caught between two gunmen with limited cover available. He fired twice, forcing them to seek shelter, then sprinted toward a cluster of rocks that might offer protection. A figure rose from a concealed position directly in his path, a man Lillian hadn't noticed before, distinguished by his city clothes and the specialized rifle in his hands. Graves, the specialist, revealing himself at last. "Hargrove!" the man called, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Captain Jedediah Hargrove. Paxton sends his regards." Jed dove as the rifle cracked, the bullet missing him by inches. He rolled behind minimal cover, returning fire with his revolver, though the distance made accuracy unlikely. Lillian aimed carefully at Graves, squeezing the trigger as she'd been taught. The shot went wide as a bullet struck the boulder beside her, sending stone fragments stinging across her cheek. The train whistle sounded again, closer now. Through the chaos of gunfire, Lillian could see it approaching the crossing, smoke billowing from its stack as it began to slow for the curve. Graves had repositioned, finding higher ground with a clear line of sight to both Jed and the approaching train. The specialist's skill was evident in his movements. Economical, precise, confident. He raised his rifle again, sighting along its length with clinical detachment. Jed broke cover, drawing the specialist's attention away from the train in a desperate gambit. Graves adjusted his aim smoothly, tracking Jed's movement with practiced ease. The rifle cracked again, and Jed stumbled, clutching his left arm where the bullet had found its mark. He kept moving, but slower now, his advantage of mobility compromised by the wound. Lillian fired repeatedly at Graves, forcing him to duck momentarily before returning his attention to Jed. The train was nearly at the crossing now, its whistle screaming warning as the engineer spotted the gunfight ahead. Graves raised his rifle for what would surely be a killing shot at the wounded and exposed Jed. Lillian aimed one final time, knowing her position was too distant for reliable accuracy, but having no other option. Before either could fire, a new shot rang out from an unexpected direction. Graves jerked backward, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the air as he collapsed. Lillian whirled toward the source of the shot, the northern bluff where Paxton had been observing. Through her field glass, she could make out Randall standing where Paxton had been, rifle still raised from the shot that had saved Jed's life. The remaining gunmen, seeing their specialist fall, and the train now passing safely across the bridge, began a disorganized retreat. Jed, despite his wound, continued advancing toward the crossing, ensuring no last-minute attempt could threaten the passengers. Lillian emerged from cover, rushing to join him as the train slowed to a complete stop just beyond the bridge. The conductor and several armed men, railroad detectives she realized, poured from the train, weapons ready, and then a familiar figure descended from the first passenger car, tall, distinguished, with the same wheat-colored hair as Lillian, but streaked with gray at the temples. Judge Raymond Thorne had arrived safely, the assassination attempt thwarted. "Raymond," Lillian called, running toward her brother. His face transformed with astonishment and joy as he recognized her. "Lillian, my God!" Their reunion was emotional but brief, the continuing danger precluding extended celebration. "Paxton?" Jed asked as he joined them, clutching his wounded arm. "Gone," Lillian replied grimly. "Randall's shot saved you, but I saw Paxton escaping on horseback during the confusion." Raymond, quickly grasping the situation, took charge with the authority of his position. "We need to get to Dodge City immediately," he declared. "I have federal marshals waiting there. If Paxton's men are in disarray, this is our opportunity to bring him to justice." As they boarded the train, Lillian found herself looking back toward the northern bluff where Randall had been. The former Union captain was nowhere to be seen, having made his choice and disappeared before he could be identified. Jed followed her gaze, understanding her thoughts. He chose a side in the end. "His own side," Lillian suggested. "Perhaps," Jed acknowledged. "Or perhaps something of the man he used to be still remained beneath the mercenary exterior." The train began moving again, carrying them toward Dodge City and the final confrontation with Hiram Paxton. Lillian sat beside her brother, the ledger pages safely delivered into his hands at last. Jed sat opposite them, allowing a railroad detective with medical training to properly bandage his wounded arm. "Thank you," Raymond said to Jed, genuine gratitude in his voice. For protecting my sister. For everything you've risked. Jed nodded acknowledgement, uncomfortable with gratitude. She protected herself more than you might think, Your Honor. Raymond, the judge corrected, after what you've done, formality seems inadequate. As the train gathered speed, Lillian found herself studying Jed's face, noting the lines of pain and exhaustion, but also something else, a lightness that hadn't been there before, as if some burden had been partially lifted from his shoulders. What happens now? She asked softly. Jed gazed out the window at the passing landscape, the setting sun painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Justice, he replied simply, and then perhaps peace, Rank. The train carried them forward toward Dodge City and whatever awaited them there. The final reckoning with Paxton still lay ahead, but for the first time since Lillian had staggered onto Jed's ranch begging for death, the future held the promise of something beyond mere survival. The sun sank below the horizon, darkness gathering around the train as it sped toward its destination. Somewhere in that darkness, Paxton was planning his next move. His empire threatened but not yet destroyed. But he no longer faced frightened, isolated victims. He faced justice, embodied in the federal judge whose life they had saved, and in the evidence Lillian had risked everything to preserve. Most dangerous of all for Paxton, he faced Jedediah Hargrove, a man who had found his purpose again, who had remembered what it meant to heal rather than harm, and who had chosen redemption over vengeance when it mattered most. The true shot of redemption had not been a bullet, but a choice, the choice to protect rather than destroy, to save rather than avenge. And in making that choice, both Jed and Lillian had begun to heal wounds deeper than any physical injury. As Dodge City's lights appeared in the distance, Jed met Lillian's gaze across the train compartment, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever came next, they would face it together, two wounded souls who had found in each other the strength to confront their demons and emerge, if not whole, then at least no longer broken.